好，谢谢。好，好。
Okay. So we got this paper. Do the song and become very confused by everything in the song, and then the rest of the class will be speaking practice. Okay? Okay. So listen a couple times. Here we go.
Brown cup.
Just the first part.
That's oh.
If you like the song, then you can go home and finish the rest. Stand up! Hey, give me as much as you can. Give me as much as you can. Amber.
One. Out. I. Out.
All the. I order. No. Sorry, I order no.
Yes.
I order no. There we go.
More than.
More. Give me one more word. Last word. Yeah. 就是说想下一个词。
先说 no， 他不回答，要换你。
这个 Alice。Two. All.
Last word. Go.
Go. Okay. All right. Good. Third one. I order no.
The first the last word is by heart.
By heart. Okay. No? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Right, good. Is the Jane. 6. All the no. More than 92. Hey, did I write it wrong? Oh, okay, I'm okay. 92. 92. Okay, alright, good. Is that next one? Dora. All the no. More than the. Okay, alright, good. Is that this one? Doris. 18. Alright. No T. No T. Belt. Alright, order. Alright, order. I order. No. More than. I have a dream. I have a dream. Okay, good. Thank you. Next one. Sally. 2. Where? This. Really? Okay? Okay, this one. Steven. 14.
Yes. I order no.
Order no.
More
than
George Scott.
George
Scott.
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 Scott. Okay. 英国口音 Scott 应该是那个人是哪里？那个 007是吃的那个 Scott， 当时在讲话哎 Scott 就是 OK， 那个 Sophie 17。I also know what the drinking Drinking. Drinking. Go. Meow. Meow. Milk. Milk. Oi.
Yes.
Oi, is this one Donnie?
And 12.
12.
I want to know about the sacrifice.
Sacrifices.
Make.
Made. Yeah, okay. Alright, good. Thank you. Next one. Joyce. 13. All. Good. All that. Okay. I ought to know. Or that. Reaction. Okay. Alright, good. Any more? Elijah. Number 8. More than quarters. Number 6. 14. 40. 40. Okay. 49. 4092. Okay. 可是你这里 or that, what's this? 4 T's. But if you have a T, it's not this, right? Remember the numbers? 4, 40. It's 40. Did you hear a T? Right. 如果有听到 T 的话，应该是 14, right? Okay. 19.
The last 4 words. Glass of the glass. Glass of the box.
Lots of the
Box.
box.
就是 box.
Box. Funny. What's this?
Box.
How do you say hungry in Chinese? So, books. Here, books. Blocks of the books. Okay, good. Hey, is it that? Any more? Cassie. Number 7. How to know? Why? Feel. Do. Okay. Alright, good. You sit down. Any more? Good morning. Last one. I ought to know about the. Okay? Alright, good. You sit down. 蛮像的。
啊，
It's not rigid, but it sounds a little bit like rigid.
那个
你看，听他的舌头有多快。Who can do it? That it? Not sure? Is it more? What are they? Andy. The one. Can you give me at least say two?
What?
Hey, Richard. What? Richard, you can see that. You don't have to understand it, you just have to listen and say it.否，经典的问题，听进去头脑马上转弯，因为你要把听到的东西靠到你已经会的单字，可是不要想应该是什么单字，听到什么讲什么就好了，懂我意思吗？如果你要想应该是什么单字，会一直听错，所以你不要想应该是什么，你听到什么讲什么，不管它的意思是什么。Lenny, Buffalo. Buffalo. Lenny, you get to that. Too long. Go ahead. Quarter, we have quarter. Quarter is okay. Quarter is okay. Go ahead. So here we have. I'll move that over here. Over that. Quarter. Quarter. 不要想应该是什么。Quarter. Box. Quarter box. So. More time.
ought to know more than the quarterbacks.
What is backs? Good. So not box, but backs. Right? You get to that? Right?
I ought to know what the Buffalo Bills do. I ought to know more than the quarterbacks who do.
Win kill.
Wouldn't kill. But we haven't got here yet, yeah? Kill. I think you're trying to guess at the word. This
I
is,
ought to know what the Buffalo Bills do. I ought to know more than the quarterbacks who do.
Wounded knee.
Wounded
knee.
good. Wounded knee. Alright. Wounded knee.
I ought to know what the Buffalo Bills do. I ought to know more than the quarterbacks who do. What happened at Sand Creek this I ought to know what I done. I ought to know what the sacrifices made. I ought to know action Sam's air raids. But I know what the sacrifices made. I ought to know action Sam.
Stand. Yeah? Okay. What that? Ring. Ring. Okay, you get to that? What that?
I ought to know more than the quarterbacks who did do what happened at Sand Creek this I ought to know what I done. I ought to know what the sacrifices made. I ought to know action Sam's hair. But I know what the sacrifices made. I ought to know action Sam's hair.
Nothing? Air, good. There we have air. Over there.
But I know what the sacrifices made. I ought to know action Sam's hair is.
Right.
Sacrifices made. I ought to know action Sam's hair is.
That's it?
I ought to know when George C. Scott and John Wayne get shot. This I ought to know. I ought to know what the drinking gourd means. C. Scott and John Wayne get shot. This I ought to know. I ought to know what the drinking gourd.
Board. Good. Board. Alright, use down. And can we fill in the blanks? Who can help fill in the blanks? Hey, no more blanks. Okay, who can help fix some of the problems? 3. Stephen. Yeah. And there is okay. There is okay.
Risk. Risk.
Risk here.
Risk.
Risk. Risk.
Risk.
Risk. Risk. Right? Race. Race. Over there.
R-A-I-S-E.
Raise.
Oh.
Raise. Okay. Laura. No. Race. Rinse. Rains. Rains. Yeah. Alright, any more? Golden. Golden. Down here. It doesn't want to work. Any more? Oh, one more time. voice.
this road goes. I know.
这是另外一个很经典的问题。如果这个我有实验过好几次，如果是听到什么听不懂，然后有人讲错，写上去，大家马上会听懂写上去的那个，可是是不对，可是还是会听得到他们写上黑板的那个东西啊。So when you listen, you have to shut your eyes. Don't look. 因为其实它完全不像 golden 啊，不好意思啊，完全不像。可是你看到 golden 就会听到 golden 啊。So shut your eyes. Don't look. Close.
I ought to know where this road goes. I ought to know.
Right?
I ought to know where this road goes. I ought to know.
这是你唱完的吗？
I ought to know where this road goes. I ought to know.
听到什么母音？我来。
I ought to know where this road goes. I ought to know.
Little bit close. I ought to know. Oops. Ah! Grade, 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 grade. 听到 A, but A wide okay, huh? But he doesn't say grade. He says grade. So what is grade? Like that. 把 grade 这个音变成重音，变成后面有 T 听不到。OK, great 哈。因为听不到它的 T， 可是可以听到它的 A 啊。可是我们知道重音的话，就是有 T 在后面。
I ought to know where this road goes. I ought to know literature.
I ought to know great literature, 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 literature. 回家可以练习 literature, 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 literature.
I ought to know where this road goes. I ought to know literature by heart.
Like great literature.
The history of art. This I ought to know. I ought to know in 1492. I ought to know what the Buffalo Bills do.
And here also, I ought to know what the. 听到的只有what 的啊，可是我们知道 what 的，如果重音的话就是 T
I
啊。
ought to know more than the quarterback's wounded knee would happen. That's in Crete. This I ought to know, but I don't. I ought to know about the sacrifices made. I ought to know ration stamps.
This one does sound like reaction, I have to admit. 有一点像 reaction， 这不是
I ought to
reaction。
know about the sacrifices made. I ought to know rations.
Rations。那为什么有 S？ 不是 S 在这里 ，S 在这里。好 ，So rations， 我们来
But I know about the sacrifices made. I ought to know ration stamps, air raids.
我们来
But I know about the sacrifices made. I ought to know ration stamps.
stamp。
But I know about the sacrifices made. I ought to know ration stamps, air.
Stamp. There. Oh wait, the S is over here, right? But it goes there, so rations.
But I know about the sacrifices made. I ought to know ration stamps, air raids.
Grade. 都很像啊。Air rates.
But I knew about the sacrifices made. I ought to know actions and air raids.
Like air rates. 它这些的差别只有它后面有 z 不是 s。其实这个也是有 z， 可是它比较重哈 rates。
I ought to know when the George C. Scott and John Wayne get shot. This I ought to know. I ought to know what the drinking gourd means.
我来，有所人 close。
C. Scott and John Wayne get shot. This I ought to know. I ought to know what the drinking gourd means.
有，可是有那个后面的音很明显嘛。
I ought to know what the drinking gourd means.
MALS， 那 meals 嘛，因为如果有 meals 的话，你会听到它的音变调。
See Scott and John Wayne get shot. This I ought to know. I ought to know what the drinking gourd means.
Good, right？ 你们没有变调，它就闭起来这样子啦。
I know. I ought to know what the drinking gourd means. I ought to know that I have a dream. I ought to know about the back of the bus.
This is a good test because what he says is different from how we write it. 它的发音这里是有它这里的口音在里面。
I ought to know that I have a dream. I ought to know about the back of.
把高的，它是 he says 把高的，but he doesn't mean 把高的 it means back 啊，懂了？
I ought to know
可是他讲的是把高的啊，把高的。
more than I have a dream. I ought to know about the back of the bus.
No CK, right? Bus. Back of the bus. Back of the bus.
I ought to know more than I have a dream. I ought to know about the back of the bus and the crack of Billy clubs. This I ought to know that don't.
Let's look. I ought to know more than I know. What does it mean? I ought to know more than I know. If we look here first, what is it I ought to know? Not must. I Amber asked me about it before. I should. Good. I should know. 我应该知道哪一些事情 right? So I ought to know more than I know. What is more than I know? Good. I should know more than I do. I should be smarter than I am. And when we come looking down at this stuff, it means I should read more newspapers and watch more TV and participate more in democracy and stuff like that. Okay, so that's what he's talking about. I ought to know where this road goes. What is where this road goes? Your direct. Okay, good. Your direction. Or you can say maybe your future. Right? I don't know where this road goes. I ought to know. I ought to think more about what I'm doing and where I want to be. Right? So I ought to know more about where this road goes. I ought to know great literature by heart. Great literature by heart. What is great literature? Like Shakespeare and who else? Mark Twain. Mark Twain's house is about an hour from my house. Mark Twain 的家离我家1个多小时而已。Mark Twain, you know Mark Twain? 我有去过他房子，他的 hometown 离我 hometown 很近。So great literature by heart. What is by heart? Yeah, you should memorize it. You should know. If somebody says Mark Twain, or somebody says Shakespeare, to be or not to be, something like that. Right? So by heart means you just think of it and you can say it. That's all I know by heart, or by 1492? Does anybody know?
拿破仑，那个不是那个德勒布发现新大陆吗？
Columbus in 1492. Columbus sailed the ocean blue. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So 1492 is when Columbus found America. Right? Columbus 发现美国在那边的时候就是1492, right? So I don't know more than 1492. What is more than 1492? 应该不要是背这个日期而已，应该是多了解它整个过程，或是它比较深入的一些问题或什么。Right? Next one, I want to know what the Buffalo Bills do. What are Buffalo Bills? What's that? No, but one of them is. One of them is about killings and stuff. But what is Buffalo Bills? Buffalo Bill is a famous cowboy. You're right. But here it says Buffalo Bills. 这首歌你回去，你可以每一条都去 Wikipedia 找，然后每一条都可以练1个小时。Buffalo Bills is an American football team. American football is called the Buffalo Bills. Every time it's like Buffalo, New York. So their city is called Buffalo. So it's called Buffalo Bills. Right? I don't know more than the quarterback's wounded knee. What is a quarterback? Quarterback. It's a person who plays football. I'm the quarterback. Oh, is that what it is? Oh, wait, I don't know. So quarterback is the guy who throws the ball in football. So what does that mean? I should know more than the quarterback's wounded knee. What is a wounded knee? Yeah, he hurt his knee. One problem with America is that people, for example, people who like football will know everything about football and everything that happens, but they don't know who the president of the United States is. So they know that the quarterback on the Buffalo Bill got hurt yesterday and he's in the hospital in whatever city, in whatever room, but you say, who's the president of the United States? So you should know more than just popular culture. 不要就什么主流文化一些现代的东西知道，你也是要多知道一些知识啊。And so I want to know about the sacrifices made. What is a sacrifice? Sacrifice. Because you are devoted to something, so you have to give up something else. You have to lose something else to get something better. So for example, for me to teach this class, I have to sacrifice my Saturday mornings. I make you really bad and say I have to sacrifice time with my baby and my son, but they're all asleep anyway, so it's not. So sacrifice, you have to give up something to get something else, right? This one, I ought to know ration stamps. What are ration stamps? Ration stamps. In countries that don't have very much food, they give you stamps. Like this stamp is worth one loaf of bread. This stamp is worth 1 jug of milk. So when you go to the store, you can only get as much food as you have the stamps for. It doesn't matter how rich you are. You can't just go and buy whatever you want. You only get whatever you have for the stamps. In America, we have something called food stamps. What are food stamps? In English. Okay, good. It's kind of like money for poor people. If you don't have enough money to buy food and stuff for your kids, the government will give you fake money. but the money that they give you, you can only buy food. And not only food, only some kinds of food. Right? So you go to the store, and instead of giving the person money, instead of giving the cashier money, you give them food stamps and you can buy the food. In America, it's a really bad system. Because you can only buy unhealthy food in America. They don't, I don't know, I'm not sure, but I read an article, you can't buy fresh fruit or fresh vegetables or something like that. You can only buy canned stuff. So the poor people can only buy unhealthy food. So it's just making them more and more unhealthy, and it's not a very good system. So, what are air raids? Do you know what a raid is? What is a raid? A raid is when an army suddenly attacks somebody. So you don't know what's going to happen. Just suddenly, they come in and they start killing and fighting and stuff like that. So then an air raid is when you use airplanes to suddenly attack a country. Like America going to Afghanistan or Iraq or something like that. You're just going about your everyday life, and then suddenly there are 10 airplanes and everything starts exploding. Like, so that's an air raid.
So teacher,
Yes.
you mean air raid in
No, not an accident. Just a sudden attack. 就是突然去攻击的话，就好像是什么伊拉克，你本来就在那边吃早餐，突然很多飞机出现，然后东西就开始爆炸，然后你根本不知道是发生什么事。Okay, an air raid. We have something called an air raid siren. Taiwan has it too. There's supposed to be a test.
Siren.
Yeah.
It says scream.
Right. So you're at school and suddenly you're and you have to, I don't know, what are you supposed to do? So what do you do? Under the table. Because if the ceiling smashes, the table's going to be okay. So anyway, it's called an air raid siren. I ought to know more than George C. Scott. Who's George C. Scott? I'm not sure. I think he's a writer. Yeah, I think he's a writer. If he's not a writer, he's a politician. 他不是作家，就是政治家。I think he's a writer. So anyway, I should know more than George C. Scott. I don't know very much about it. So I ought to know more than I know too. I ought to know what the drinking gourd means. What is a drinking gourd? And drinking is for drinking, right? And in Chinese culture, there's the and then bonk and he's fighting, but he's drinking, right? The gourd is the thing that he drinks from. It looks something like ooh, right? Okay, something like that. It's called a gourd. It's a melon or something, but it's hollow inside. So it's a drinking gourd. So I don't know what the drinking gourd means. What does that mean? I don't know. 应该是 maybe something. 这个应该是比较跟哲学有关系的。这个可以去判断，不是答案。I don't know more than I have a dream. What does I have a dream? Hey, Martin Luther King Jr. Right? I have a dream that black boys and white boys will be able to go to school together. I have a dream that, right? A very famous speech. What's that?
Beautiful picture.
Yeah, beautiful future, right? Exactly. So I should know more than that. What does that mean? 应该是我应该是要去了解这些人的背景，然后他们现在的状况，然后怎么可以去帮助他们，或是什么的。我是就知道他讲的那个，哇，他讲个好美，就结束了。And I want to know about the back of the bus. What's the back of the bus?
About that time, the black people had to stand. That was it, not stand, had to sit
Right.
the seats.
Right. About the same time as Martin Luther King Jr., when white people were higher than black people, if a white person got on the bus and there's a black person sitting there, the black person would have to stand up and move to the back of the bus so the white person could sit down. So we call that the back of the bus, right? Anytime you talk about the back of the bus, you're talking about white and black conflict, okay? So I should know more about the back of the bus. Means I should know more about the history of black people and white people having conflict and blah, 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 okay? And on your paper, there's lots of other stuff too. The history of art is okay. Sand Creek. Sand Creek is probably what, I'm not sure about Sand Creek specifically, but it's probably what Lin was referring to. Some kind of killing Native Americans or some kind of fight or something like that. 因为平常美国有冲突的话，都会取那个地方的名字当做那个冲突的那个名字啊。John Wayne， who's John Wayne？